Excellent. Okay, so next up we have Michiki from ISOC. We're honoured to have him here. He was on the panel earlier, you would have seen. And Michiki will be sharing with us some of the factors affecting the internet in Africa, the internet evolution in Africa, and in particular, lessons learned from Kenya.
Thank you, Jennifer. And well, I think I already made my introduction earlier, so I'll sort of skip that part. First, I'd like to thank LINX for the invite. Coming back here again. For some of you who may not know this is not my first LINX members meeting. It's my second. And the first one was 18 years ago, in 2006. And at the time, I was not working at the Internet Society. I was working for the Kenyan CCTLD, KENIC, and I was also the CTO of the Kenya Internet Exchange Point. And so the invite was to come and talk about what was happening in Kenya, because Kenya was at the point of going through an internet liberalization process where we were opening up the market to more competition, more connectivity, and so on. And so it was interesting to share the perspectives, but also learn about what was happening in the UK at the time, where LINX was, so that we could take some of those lessons back. And that has also helped me in some of the work that I've gone on to do with respect to IXP development around the world. Now, 18 years later, I'm back to talk about the factors driving internet evolution in Africa and taking or drawing lessons from what has happened in Kenya over that 18-year period. First, I want to draw some inspiration from a Belgian designer called Thomas Lomé, who said, the next big thing will be a lot of small things. I think there's some truth in that with respect to bridging the connectivity divide or getting more people connected, that the next big thing will be a lot of small things. I also want to draw some inspiration from two countries that I've had to visit around the world, one in Asia, one in Latin America before I go to Kenya, that sort of have adopted this sort of thinking that the next big thing is a lot of small things when it comes to access. The first one is Bangladesh. I went to Dhaka probably more than 10 years ago, and while walking on the streets, I noted that there was a lot of fiber strung between poles, that to a certain extent you would see the poles, the power lines or the power poles were actually leaning towards the center because of the sheer weight of the fiber. It's more than 10 years ago. And I asked my hosts, is this one company or there are many companies? They said, oh, there are lots of companies that are actually providing this. And it took about a day for you to get connected to fiber then. It was not fiber to the home, it was fiber to the cabinet, and then you'll get Ethernet ports pulled into your respective premise. And I thought it was interesting because when we went to the exchange point, BDIX at that time, optical switches were not available then or affordable then. So what they had was a lot of connections would land in on fiber. Then they have these transceivers that would connect into the Ethernet switch at 100 megabits. So it was fascinating because I was coming from Kenya and we weren't at that point in time. We weren't having all connections landing at the exchange point using fiber. So it was quite interesting for me to see that. Now, at present, when you look at where Bangladesh is, Bangladesh has a population of 170 going to 180 million people. According to their regulator, they have over 2,000 small networks that are operating at the hyper-local level. So that means micro-operators at that level. Some statistics are showing that in Bangladesh, more than 11 million people are actually connected on fixed fiber connections. So that's actually a huge number. But it takes time to get there. So they have an enabling environment policy-wise that's allowing this to happen. And as a result, When you look at our Pulse platform, where we have Internet Resilience Index and the country reports, which is actually analyzing the market readiness, the infrastructure, is also looking at security and also looking at the speed of connectivity. The resilience index for Bangladesh is above 51%, meaning that that's how well the network in Bangladesh is likely to respond or react to any intentional disruptions. So it's above average. It's actually doing fairly well. The second country I wanted to talk about is Brazil. Brazil has a population of over 200 million people. CGIBR had a study recently in 2022 that showed that over 80%, about 86% of the networks that provide connectivity in Brazil are small to medium, meaning 1 to 50 staff in between. Some other statistics actually show that majority of the connections in terms of people who are getting connections using fixed connectivity are from using these small providers. I remember looking at a EuroIX statistic some years back, and that was one of the things that triggered my thinking, was that the number of devices that connect to the IX, or the routers that connect to the exchange point, there were a lot of router boards. And I was curious why router boards were quite high. And if you look at today's EuroIX IXPDB statistics, you will see that router boards actually are the top five number of devices that connect to the exchange point. Part of that was because of Brazil. They have over 2,000 networks connecting to the exchange point, and a huge number of them are actually using router boards. Well, needless to say that the Internet Resiliency Index in Brazil, because of the diversity of networks across, is quite high, is at 56%. But they've been doing this for a long time. Last time I was in Brazil is more than 15 years ago, and I saw those small operators in place. So what are the things we learn? Those two markets have quite a huge number of micro and medium ISPs that are helping to bring more people connected. They have a strong technical community, growing peering ecosystem. In some of the work that we do across Africa, Latin America, and Asia in the emerging markets is to talk to policymakers around the need to create an enabling environment where you can have the emergence of many small operators so that you can actually get more people connected, grow the opportunities for using the internet and have a global impact. Now, in doing so, we have to explain something to policymakers that's often lost to them. The policy and regulatory environment is sort of geared and designed to cater for the large operators, not for the medium and small. And so as a result, what happens is that they hope that the large operators will bring coverage to everyone. And one of our partners that we work with, Steve Song, some of you may know of his work at Mozilla and APC, went to the painstaking effort of using this example of putting stones in glass jars to explain what that means when they cater for large operators in the policy and regulatory licensing frameworks that they have. So it means if they only cater for the large operators, it may look full, it means full coverage, but there's still lots of gaps that exist. And they need to open up the market so that other types of operators, medium-sized and small-sized operators, can come in, because it's not fully covered. Coverage and access are not fully there yet. And so we've used this to sort of talk about connecting the unconnected, getting more different types of models acceptable within the policy and regulatory framework so that more access can emerge in terms of opportunities for people to invest in access, and then connect more people to come at various market levels, not those who have high incomes, but medium and low incomes as well. So I want you to keep the image that you see there because we'll sort of come back to it later. In some of the work that we did in the past, we had an initiative called the 80-20 by 2020, where we were trying to encourage markets to get to a point where 80% of the traffic that they access is locally accessible or locally available within the country through the peering fabric that exists in each and every market. And we tried to understand some of those barriers. And the first one, of course, was market reform or policy, which needed to be addressed, which will then serve as a catalyst to open up the rest of the market, meaning address the issue of long-distance connectivity, start having conversations about content regulation, which will then encourage the investment in data center operators and CDNs and so on to come into that market. And then, of course, encourage a healthy peering environment or within a country. The IXPs at the time we would see were a bit rigid because if folks don't have clue, then they don't go in. They can't engage the regulator or policymakers in making the right market reforms from a policy and regulatory perspective. We also want them to have clue around, routing, BGP, so that once the exchange point is in place, they can actually be the ones doing the configuration to make sure that the traffic stays within the market. The next thing is, after they're able to influence policy reforms, you get the policy reforms, you get an enabling environment. And once you have an enabling environment, then the infrastructure development starts happening. You get cross-border interconnection, you get good backhaul connectivity across the country. And then the next thing that sort of comes is the digitization process, where now more enterprises, government are providing e-services or digitized services, and that then is also dependent on having electronic payments. And this is important because how do you monetize the content that has been digitized? So in Africa, you probably have seen a lot of statistics that most people are not banked. So what's going to happen next to get people? Because if you don't have a bank account, you don't have a credit card, how do you pay for digital services? And so e-payments becomes a thing that needs to be digitized. And then, or rather payments need to be digitized to get e-payments. And then innovation. And innovation now becomes the next big thing that because you have connectivity, in abundance, then you're online. You can now start thinking of innovative solutions to address local problems, regional problems, and also allows you to come to the point of being able to scale. So Kenya in that period has been going through, since 2005, 2006, has been going through that transformation and evolution in their policy reforms, and we've done quite a number of things. What you see on the slide sort of gives you some of the recent numbers, but I like to explain what has happened in Kenya through one example. In 2022, we had our national elections. Now, as often, elections in my part of the world comes with many challenges, including internet shutdowns, rigging, etc., etc. This was the first election that we did in Kenya that was highly digitized. We had 40,000 polling stations, 40,000 polling stations across the country. Most of, actually, in all of those polling stations, what was happening is that once you vote and they tabulate the results from those 40,000 polling stations, the results of that were going to be transmitted using the internet to servers that were seated in Nairobi, the capital. That's a major feat for a country. So that actually happened. 97%, I think it was 97 or 98% of all those 40,000 polling stations were able to successfully transmit the polling results to servers that were seated in Nairobi. The Electoral Commission, or the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, IEBC, has the website. And basically, any person would actually go to that website and just keep, actually it was automatically refreshing, and you would see the results from each and every polling station, and you'd get the data, and you could actually do your own tallying. So you didn't have to wait for the Electoral Commission to give you the results. You could do your own tallying. So many media houses went out to create their own tallying stations, and they were collecting the data from this website. And at some point, the file size got big. It was about 10 GB, because there was quite a lot of data coming in. And at the end on the second day, as the information was coming in, there was a submarine cable cut with one of the major submarine operators. Now, what was happening is that we were all glued to our TVs, whether you were streaming that, and most people were actually streaming the TVs for using your favorite streaming channel, YouTube, whatever, and some were watching the actual TV. Social media was alive with, all sorts of comments. And I was trying to get some work done, so I had to join some Zoom calls on the second day in the afternoon. And I realized when I joined Zoom was not working well. I couldn't see some of the videos, and there seemed to be a problem. So I realized there is a problem somewhere, and I don't know what it is. So yes.
Voting results were being updated in real time.
Yes.
So just for clarification, so the voting results were being updated real time. This wasn't at the end of polling. This was during the day.
Oh, no. At the end of polling, once they did the tallying at the polling station, they would update that. They had a tablet connected to the internet that they would use to feed the figures.
Okay, so it's not like every time someone casts.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yes, correct. So, so as the results were coming in, I'm working with a screen, streaming, watching the news coming in. I noticed that everything seems to be working well except my Zoom for my meetings. And I write to my account manager, like, is there something wrong? Because my connection seems to be funny on Zoom. And when I did the troubleshooting, I realized there was a problem after my service provider when I'm trying to go internationally. And they told me, yes, there's just been a reported fiber cut around Egypt on one of the submarine cables, and we're trying to reroute to a different path. Now, I want you to take a moment and think about it from, if this election, largely dependent on digital technologies, had this outage happening right in the middle of tallying votes, what's the first thing people would do? Yes, conspiracy theories will be in plenty. Someone is trying to rig the election, etc., etc. But funnily, there was not a single bit of that popped up anywhere. Why? Because the exchange point worked, the networks worked, the hosting of the website of the Electoral Commission was actually in country, on a CDN platform. So everything that everyone cared about at that point in time actually worked. Anything else we didn't care about, even if it didn't work, life was fine. So that sort of summarizes where Kenya is or was at 2022, and that's getting better. Because of those reforms, that investment that's been going on, the internet is slowly becoming a critical function of society in supporting democracy. And we're seeing the impact of that based on where the connection of the international connection capacity for Kenya is. It's largely to our neighbors and a lot less to Europe. What are the factors that are accelerating that? Two things: accessibility and adoption. Accessibility is coming because we have a growing number of micro ISPs. You may not see that from the previous slide where I say there are 192 ASNs. Yes, the regulation is yet to catch up, There are actually about 300 of these small micro ISPs. One is on the photo that you see there. This is near my neighborhood. If you look closely along the power lines, you will see a lot of strands. That's not power, that's actually fiber. Most of them are not also licensed, but they're getting there. A good number of them are licensed, but the government is working on that, or rather the policymakers. We're trying to get those conversations going around. How do we get them licensed? Because the next thing is they're not visible because they don't have ASNs, so you don't get to see their networks. And the way they do their deployments is also low cost. The cost of the equipment, there are lots of low-cost vendors that have actually come in, equipment vendors, that allow them to sort of get this equipment low cost. The other thing I also learned recently is that there is a lot of hand-me-downs, but, well, they're not really hand-me-downs, but equipment that's no longer being used in other markets is resold as second-hand equipment in Africa that is also enabling FTTH to happen. And based on those changes or those developments, we did some analysis. In around 2020, 70% of all the traffic that networks in Kenya were consuming was actually available at the peering points that were there. The second thing is adoption. E-government services have gone to a great extent. Now, that's a picture of a cyber cafe. Most people would think cyber cafes would have died, but they got a second lease of life with e-government services, because for all those things that you see written there, I actually need to use the internet to get government services. I needed to use the internet to apply for the visa for me to come to the UK. And I only needed to show up to where I was doing biometrics and handing my passport for the visa to be stamped in, and then collect my passport. Everything else is done online. So that kind of transformation of digitizing services is key to bringing adoption, because there is relevance in the content. And the second thing is digital payments. In Kenya, nearly 70% of all e-commerce payments use mobile money payments or alternative payment methods. So that's quite huge. I'll be honest, I do some online purchases as well, but most of the time, if I have to use M-Pesa, you probably have heard of M-Pesa. I need to use M-Pesa to make payments. So it's a thing. Today, the limit on M-Pesa payments has gone up from around about $700 to right now you could transact up to about $2,500 on a single payment using mobile money M-Pesa. So that means you can be able to monetize the content. And so a lot of services that are online, actually you just quickly pay using mobile money payments. And that's great. So at a continental level, what is really driving that? So national reforms, lots of national policy reforms are happening at the national level. And if you look at the data that's collected by the ITU, you will see like that 90% of the countries are actually going through a transformation process or in the transformation process. So none of, just about 10% have really been, are the ones that are lagging behind. And this transformation process is also then being pushed forward by continental level policy initiatives, like the Pan-African payment systems, payment and settlement system, which will allow most people in Africa to have a centralized way of making payments across borders. So that's coming into effect. They've already selected a host country. I think it's going to be Kenya, or at least from what I had. So that's going to be great in terms of making payments, transaction payments to buy something in Nigeria or from whichever country I am in. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is something that's trying to remove the barrier, the boundary sort of with respect to cross-border trade. There's an initiative about the digital single market that's happening in the continent to have a single digital market for transactions, for digital trade, and so on and so forth. So quite a number of things that are driving and pushing countries towards a digital economy. If you look at other ITU data, it sort of shows that the countries that are actually at the advanced level, you will see Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana that are leading, but everyone else is sort of in between that transitioning phase. And so it's showing that there's a lot of policy reforms that are ongoing at the national level across many of those countries. But in tandem, because we've already started making those policy reforms, the infrastructure investment has started happening. So we have a lot of terrestrial fiber, submarine cable fibers are also being built, and that's really bringing down the cost of access from the international capacity to the backhaul is actually coming down. It's not as it used to be. We are seeing a lot of data center facilities coming in, and the work that we've been doing across the region over the years to support the development of IXPs has actually seen a growth, a huge growth in the number of exchange points across the continent, with 53 of them as of present across 36 countries. And what follows next? You start seeing the traffic is now starting to follow the path of this infrastructure. And so South Africa, of course, being the biggest market and the one that actually started the policy reforms ahead of most, Mauritius, Kenya, on the west, we're seeing Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. Djibouti is an outlier because of the number of submarine cables that are terminating there, but it's equally becoming an interesting space. And on the other side, the question is, what's the demand side? The digitization process that's happening across the continent is actually driving more users to come online. Because if my mother needs to do something with the government or get any government services, she needs to have connectivity. So at the end of it all, my mom has connection at home. She has a fiber connection at home that she uses because she needs to engage, because there's relevance in terms of having to need to have connectivity to do some of the things that she does. All that, and if you look at all the statistics that are showing there, whether it's the payments, whether it's the availability of digital context, the level at which enterprises are digitizing, all that is showing a lot of potential. And essentially, the most conservative data point I've seen is that the number of e-commerce users in Africa is expected to reach 187 million users by 2028. So that's quite a huge number of people. And that's a conservative one. I've seen much, much higher numbers. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions or reactions you may have before I sort of go into my conclusion of where I'm seeing the opportunities for Africa. We're told we need to ask these questions. All right, so where is the opportunity for Africa? It's in micro-operators. According to the ITU, 80% of the global internet traffic in 2022 came from fixed connectivity, not mobile broadband. Now remember the slides, the jar, the three jars, one with big stones, one with big and medium stones, and the other one with all the three sizes of stones. The regulation in Africa sort of has mostly addressed the first jar. And that first jar really allows for the mobile operators and the large operators to sort of come and provide connectivity. They haven't really fully opened up policy and regulation to address the second and third jar, which is the medium size and the small size. And that's where the challenge and the opportunity lies. And so if we are to get more people connected then we need to have the second jar and the third jar being reflected in what's happening across the region. And I'll explain why. If you look at Africa, there are only less than 2,500 ASNs across the continent. 47% of them assigned to ISPs according to Afrinic. So less than 50% of those ASNs are going to ISPs. Now, compared to what I showed you earlier with Brazil and Bangladesh in terms of the ASNs. So there's work that needs to happen there. If you look at the issues of affordability, because the policy is supporting the large operators through mobile, and if you look at the statistics, the mobile coverage is quite good across the continent. But what do mobile operators offer? Capped capacity. So you're buying data in bundles. So if you remember the evolution path, after the investment of the infrastructure, you go into digitization, and then you go into innovation. For you to get to innovation, you need unlimited access. There is no way you're going to innovate if you have limited access. Now, I'll tell you what my mother does. When she leaves the house, she turns off mobile data, goes around, does her things. I send her a WhatsApp message, and she only gets to see it when she gets back home. That's what mobile data, when it's expensive and it's capped data, that's what it does to users. So fixed connectivity, and lots of it, is what's going to help get to the next level where we have innovation. So a lot of what I've shown here today is by and large informed by our work that we do with our partners. I'd like to thank LINX again for the invite, but also for the collaboration we've had over these years, because through their support in many ways, and other partners in this room, I think I've seen Meta as well, and others, they've actually been able to support some of the work we do. We work at the intersection of policy and technology. So the policy, we contribute to policy development across all the emerging markets so that we can open up that space, things like community networks and so on. So we are looking to expand those collaborations, those partnerships, so that we can actually have a larger impact, and we can be able to bring more people online. I'm here with a colleague. Her name is Sally. She's seated at the back. She's based here in the UK. And so we are looking forward to having engagements and conversations with you to see if we can do more collaboration so that we can certainly help propel this region and other regions, and not just Africa, to be able to bridge the connectivity gap, of which at present stands at 2.6 billion people who are yet to be connected. So we'd like to see more people getting connected. And we think the next big thing is a lot of small service providers. Thank you very much. All right, questions?
Any more questions? Two.
Thank you for that. Is the end result really more cables, more fixed connectivity, or just better access everywhere? Would this be a brilliant use case for some sort of wide area mesh Wi-Fi kind of thing?
That's actually a good question. The question, I think, will be, how do we measure the resilience? Is the resilience as a result of more infrastructure, or more infrastructure and more operators, or fewer operators and more infrastructure? And there's a fine balance between both. And I think in many cases, we don't even have enough infrastructure in most of these places to be able to get to that fine balance with respect to access. So I think we are yet to get to a point where we can put that question that, like, do we need more operators or more infrastructure on the ground? And in most of them, yes, there is. Statistics are showing that more than 600 million people, I think, are within a 10 or 25 kilometer radius to a fiber node. It still means there are people who don't have, not very close to a fiber node. So we still do need more infrastructure. I think the question will be, at what point do we start drawing that balance? I hope that answers. Yeah.
On the subject of developing markets, we know that some of the African continent has large conurbations separated by miles and miles of nothing before the next conurbation. You talked about the multiplicity of small operators. Do you see hubbing and the operation of low Earth orbit satellite as a hub for them all to congregate round, a way of breaking that connectivity barrier in Africa?
Yes. So suddenly, LEOs, for instance, are something that's quite interesting in that, yes, getting to certain points, the economics of building fiber to bridge, to get to those underserved remote areas is a challenge. So if we're able to get LEO connectivity into those communities and then expanding it using more affordable technologies like wireless or even putting fiber on the ground, then that would be, I'll say, a transitional path to getting more people connected. I think there was another.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if there's a danger of people overbuilding infrastructure, just looking at what was there. So how do we help them to build infrastructure where there is none, as opposed to loads of people building infrastructure in the same place, which is a big problem in terms of there'll be people who are overconnected and people who haven't got anything. And I just wondered how are you measure? So I mean, some of the build that's going on there is fantastic, but is it for everybody? Clearly not. So those people that are building in the same place, at some point in time, one of them, some of them disappear because the economic realities will catch up with them. So how do we ensure that where people are building is where it's needed and where it's not going to cause future economic challenges for those that have built that infrastructure?
That's a good question. So one thing is suddenly more engagement with the stakeholders through working with the policymakers, the regulators, when it comes to things like infrastructure sharing. There's still that inherent need with operators where they feel like if I don't own the cable, then my bottom line doesn't look good.
Yep.
And moving them to a point where they actually realize that don't all need to build.
Yeah, but also 10 people owning the same cable running down the same street
Yes.
is equally as bad as not owning the cable.
Yes. And the other part which there's an initiative that we're supporting is the mapping of the cables.
Yeah.
So there's an initiative led by Mozilla, APC, ISOC, and the World Bank to have a standard for mapping cables, terrestrial fiber, so that actually folks know where it is.
Yeah.
Because there is very little knowledge. What you see in these maps is just a fraction of what people have offered to give, but there is no real current way of keeping that updated. So there's an initiative going on to work with the operators and the regulators to standardize how the fiber is mapped so that folks can see the opportunities of, I don't need to invest here because someone has already done that. So let's do fiber strand swapping or some other way of business opportunities, which means that I don't have to invest where someone else already has invested.
Yeah, but can you use the licensing to manage this where, hey, we're only going to give you a license if you're building where someone already hasn't. So trying to franchise areas. So if you know that 10 ISPs have built down, this area, that just don't give it to say, hey, we're not going to give any more licenses for this area. We're going to give a license here and help. So if people have got time to invest or money to invest, what you want to make sure is that they're investing it in places where there's long-term viability of it, as opposed to overbuilding in loads of places where the reality is most folks aren't going to survive it. You understand the point?
Yes, I do. When I hear regulation coming in,
Look, no one likes regulation.
Yes,
trust me.
so I think you want to keep it at a lighter level, because part of the reason why Africa has struggled so much is because of over-regulation, as opposed
Or
to
wrong regulation.
yes,
perhaps.
but yes. So again, it's part of that evolution in the regulation process and more stakeholder engagements that will sort of find that middle line of what would be ideal. But I think the business part is the one that's going to actually influence a lot more of how the bills progress.
Okay.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hi, I'm originally from Bangladesh, so thanks for sharing the data from Bangladesh. And I know in details since I'm from Bangladesh. So what my perspective is in terms of connectivity to the people is the people can afford the operators that are mainly based in city areas. But rural people, they don't actually get the fixed connectivity, so they have to rely on the mobile connectivity. But whoever from rural area they can afford, operators are not willing to go to them because of the cost and everything. So I think that's something is has to build the infrastructure from the government side to digitalize the country in terms of the cost and the connectivity to the people. Right now, people maybe 25% of the country's people having the fixed connectivity, but rest 75% they have to rely on mobile. And as you mentioned, mobile connectivity is expensive, and they has to rely on the fixed data, and whenever they need, they access it. So that's my point of sharing my thoughts on in terms of Bangladesh, and I believe that's the same case in the African continent as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the number of people who are connected in Bangladesh, it's 38%, so it's not higher. And to your point, we need different business models so that we can get more people connected. A lot of them, the current business models where it's the large operators expected to bring more people online, cannot address. So remember the 3 J's? So it's the large mobile operators that are sort of covering the bulk of the country, but not bringing everyone connected. So how do we get medium and small operators across the country? So what are the business models we need to look at? And create the awareness about those business models so that we can have more of them emerging and operating to cover the gaps where the large operators are not actually able to cover. So certainly an issue and an area that needs to be addressed going forward. Thank you. I completely agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.